But before we get into the evidence of Clement's authorship of the letter, it's worth specifically pointing out that it doesn't really matter whether First Clement explicitly names Clement in the body of the text. Like many nonfiction writings, both ancient and modern, none of the Gospels and many New Testament letters do not name and specify their own authors in the body of their text either. So we should be holding First Clement to the same standard that we do those other New Testament writings. Though there are messengers or witnesses named at the very end of the letter, it is not clear that they were ordained ministers. In fact, similar to how Ignatius's letter to the Roman Church uniquely declines to mention the names of any Roman clergy, let alone a bishop, it is also quite possible that no specific names of any Roman Christian clergy are given in order to avoid imperial persecution. First Clement itself refers to sudden and successive calamitous events that have befallen the church at Rome that many believe refer to imperial persecution. But regardless of the reason for why Clement is not mentioned explicitly, the universal external testimony to Clement's authorship of this letter is more than sufficient to establish his authorship of the letter. First Clement almost certainly got its name from the fact that all the earliest sources commenting on it associate it with Clement of Rome, who they identify as Bishop of Rome. This is like all the earliest sources and manuscripts referring to Mark as the author of the Gospel of Mark, and so on with other Gospels. Perhaps the earliest extant source to affirm Clement's authorship is Irenaeus in the 2nd century, who does so in the context of explaining that anyone can find true Christian doctrine by observing the apostolic tradition of the Church of Rome, as preserved in its named succession of bishops, including Clement. Irenaeus writes, "It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church, who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And we are in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times. Those who are neither taught nor knew of anything like what these heretics rave about. For they," meaning the apostles, "were desirous that these men should be very perfect and blameless in all things, whom also they were leaving behind as their successors, delivering up their own place of government to these men. Since, however, it would be very tedious, in such a volume as this, to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all heretics by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church, namely the Church of Rome, on account of its preeminent authority. The blessed apostles, then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. This man, as he had seen the blessed apostles, and had been conversant with them, might be said to have the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears, and their traditions before his eyes. Nor was he alone in this, for there were many still remaining who had received instructions from the apostles. In the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians, exhorting them to peace, renewing their faith, and declaring the tradition which it had lately received from the apostles. In this order, and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the truth have come down to us. And this is the most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith, which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now, and handed down in truth." So, strictly speaking, Irenaeus doesn't explicitly say Clement wrote First Clement as Bishop of Rome, but does very closely associate it with him and his time. It's also worth emphasizing just how close and faithful Clement was to the apostles, Peter and Paul, and their tradition, according to Irenaeus. While Tertullian does not mention the letter First Clement, he is another early witness to Clement being a successor to Peter at Rome. And specifically, he tells us that Peter, the apostle, ordained Clement. Tertullian writes, "But if there be any heresies which are bold enough to plant themselves in the midst of the apostolic age, that they may thereby seem to have been handed down by the apostles, because they existed in the time of the apostles, we can say, let them produce the original records of their churches, let them unfold the roll of their bishops, running down in due succession from the beginning, in such a manner that that first bishop of theirs shall be able to show for his ordainer and predecessor some one of the apostles, or of apostolic men. A man, moreover, who continued steadfast with the apostles. For this is the manner in which the apostolic churches transmit their registers, as the church of Smyrna, which records that Polycarp was placed therein by John, as also the church of Rome, which makes Clement to have been ordained in like manner by Peter. In exactly the same way, the other churches likewise exhibit their several worthies, whom, as having been appointed to their episcopal places by apostles, they regard as transmitters of the apostolic seed. Let the heretics contrive something of the same kind." Again, Tertullian sees Clement as an example of a succession of bishops ordained by the apostles, and that steadfastly transmits the teachings of the apostles, something the heretics should be required to provide, but can't. Let's see what we can learn about Clement from Eusebius. He writes, "The Apostle Paul in his epistle to the Philippians informs us that this Clement was his fellow worker. His words are as follows: With Clement and the rest of my fellow laborers, whose names are in the book of life. There is extant an epistle of this Clement, which is acknowledged to be genuine and is of considerable length and of remarkable merit. He wrote it in the name of the Church of Rome, to the Church of Corinth, when a sedition had arisen in the latter church. Clement in his epistle, which is accepted by all, and which he wrote in the name of the Church of Rome, to the Church of Corinth." And in another section, Eusebius writes, "Others that this Clement himself translated the epistle," referring to Hebrews. The latter seems more probable because the epistle of Clement and that to the Hebrews have a similar character in regard to style, and still further because the thoughts contained in the two works are not very different. And then quoting Origen, Eusebius says, "But who wrote the epistle? In truth, God knows. The statement of some who have gone before us is that Clement, bishop of the Romans, wrote the epistle, and of others that Luke did." So not only does Eusebius explicitly affirm the genuine and universally accepted authorship of Clement for the letter First Clement, but he also twice tells us why Clement wrote in the first person plural. Because Clement was writing in the name of the entire Roman Church with all its presbyters and deacons, and perhaps auxiliary or subordinate bishops. Because of the way Irenaeus and Eusebius speak about the authorship of First Clement, I wonder if it is possible Clement was not pope at the time he wrote First Clement. Maybe he was an auxiliary bishop or chief presbyter or deacon in the Roman Church. Maybe he was the right-hand man of the Pope at that time when he wrote First Clement, and only later became Pope. But maybe this is a remote possibility. It's also worth pointing out that some thought it probable that Clement either wrote the letter to the Hebrews or translated it into Greek, the canonical version of the New Testament book we have today. Lastly, for the objection we've been dealing with, there is the fact that First Clement is not absolutely consistent in using the first person plural throughout the letter. There is at least one slip into the first person singular I. In chapter 17 we find, "Let us be imitators also of those who, in goatskins and sheepskins, went about proclaiming the coming of Christ." I mean Elijah, Elisha, and Ezekiel among the prophets, with those others to whom a like testimony is borne in Scripture. So this Greek phrase means I say, or I mean, which is first person singular. So clearly and intuitively, one person was writing or dictating the letter, even though it is written on behalf of the whole Roman Church, just as Eusebius told us. Fourth and fifth century fathers will continue to affirm Clement's authorship of First Clement. But now that we've sufficiently established Clement's authorship of First Clement,